Welcome back to Strengthen. It's so good to be with you again, and I hope that over the last week you've already been able to leverage your spiritual pathway, and I continue to pray that you will leverage it moving forward, because I really do believe, and I'm totally convinced, that when you leverage your spiritual pathway, man, your relationship with God just gets better and better and better and better. Today I'm excited because this is the first of 4 sessions that we're going to spend talking about the Bible. And I'm excited about it because I know the power that the Bible, that spending time reading and engaging and meditating on and learning from and living out the scriptures has on the life of an individual, no matter where they are in their faith journey. And huge research was done that had so many data points where that people got surveyed, like hundreds of thousands of people got surveyed around their spiritual health and what it looks like to be growing and moving forward in their faith. And that when they undid the research and when it all came out, what was discovered, that the number one indicator of whether someone was moving forward in their faith was the time that they spent engaging in the Bible. And I firmly believe that each of us, if we can spend 15 minutes a day engaging with the Bible, it will shape the rest of our day. So I'm excited for what we're going to cover over the next 4 weeks here at Strengthen. I just going to ask a bit of a joke as we think about the Bible, but sometimes I wonder who really wrote the Bible. You know, I start thinking, who wrote the Bible? Who could have written the Bible? And I think, well, I don't know. What about my great uncle? Could have he written the Bible? And then I read through the Bible and I find a verse and it says, hey, if you don't work, you don't eat. I'm like, no. He can't have written the Bible. I think, I wonder if a child potentially wrote the Bible. But then I come across the verse and it says, spare the rod, spoil the child. I'm like, no, there's no way a child wrote the Bible. I think, oh, well, my wife, she's really smart. Could she have written the Bible? But then I get to the verse and it says, wives, submit. Nope, she definitely didn't write the Bible. But what makes this book so incredible is the fact that it was actually written by 40 different authors, that it contains 66 different manuscripts that all tell one unified story. And next week, we're going to really have a look at an overview of the Bible that will help you so much. But what I want to do today is just inspire you a little bit and help you see something. This comes from the Psalms, and this is what it says. And I want you to see it there. There's a pattern here. It says, "Oh, how I love your law. I meditate on it all day long." And then I'm just going to take you through it. I meditate on it all day long. I read it, and I think about it. I read it, and I think about it. I read it, and I think about it. And because this was in the Psalms, when the psalmist wrote this, what he was referring to really was just the first 5 books of the Bible. I read those over and over. I meditate on it. I think about it. It consumes my thoughts. But then he continues, your commands are always with me. And look what it says. And make me wiser than my enemies. I have more insight than my teachers, for I meditate on your statutes. You see, I read it, and I do so because it makes me wiser. I have more insight. He continues, I have more understanding than the elders, for I obey your precepts. When you read this, you will get more wisdom, more insight, more understanding. And then he says, for I have kept my feet from every evil path, so I might obey your word. You see, it's one thing to read it, to think about it, to meditate on it. So we want to read it, then we've got to live it. And it's one thing to read it, but it's a whole other thing to live it. But when you live it, man, you keep your feet from every evil path. He continues, I have not departed from your laws, for you yourself have taught me. And then he says this, how sweet are your words to my taste, sweeter than honey to my mouth. You see, we read it and then we obey it. And when we do that, when we start to read it and then we start to obey it, we really start to live it out. We actually discover that we really do love it. Just as the psalmist would say, your words are sweeter than honey. Because we've spent time reading it, because we've spent time meditating on it, and then we've gone and we've actually put it into practice. We've lived it out in our daily life. Do you know what happens? We love it because we see the benefits of it. We see the way that understanding, that insight has helped us. And we're like, man, I'm so glad I read that. I'm so glad I did that because now I do live with less regret. But we've got to spend the time reading it, meditating on it. We've got to learn it. Then we've got to live it. And we will come to love it. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, I love this. Jesus has given what is arguably known as his most profound teaching. In fact, a lot of scholars would say that the Sermon on the Mount wasn't simply one sermon that Jesus gave one time, but rather it was the collection of the same things that he just taught everywhere when he was just teaching these things all the way through. And when Jesus gets to the end of the Sermon on the Mount and he wants to close it out, do you know what he does? He doesn't just pause and say, okay, that's all I have to teach. No, go and do it. What Jesus does is Jesus crafts a story to tell the audience, to remind the audience of how important it is, not only that they listen to what he says, but that they go and do what he says. So this is where Jesus talks about the man who builds his house on the sand and contrasts him with the man who builds his house on the rock, right? He says, look, a lot of you, if you simply hear my words, you're like the man who builds his house on the sand. The house goes up easy because hearing is easy. But then when the rains come down and the winds blow, what's going to happen to the house? It's going to fall down because it's built on sand. But the one who hears my words and applies them and lives them and puts them into practice is like the person who built their house on rock. And that is hard. That is difficult. The difficulty isn't so much simply in hearing and reading. No. The difficulty is in the application. But he says, hey, if you apply it, you're going to be like that man who built his house on the rock. When the winds blow and the rains come down, that house is going to stay strong. And oftentimes the difference between our faith, what keeps our faith strong, isn't whether we know what this is or are we reading it, but are we really living it? And I just love that Jesus took the time to paint a whole picture around this rather than saying it in a sentence. He says, no. This is so important that my audience understand that application is everything. That he gives us the parable about building on the sand and building on the rock in order to reinforce it. But here's what I know to be true, and I'm sure you do too. That we have to take the time to learn what this is. We've got to take the time to read it, to meditate on it. Then we've got to make sure we're living it. And if we do that, we will come to love it. Now, before we finish off, I just want to just deviate from this for one moment, just to say, when it comes to talking with people about the Bible, I've found most people fall into one of two camps. And again, because you're watching this, when the group that you're watching, I'm assuming you're going to be in the second camp. But some people, when they talk to me about the Bible, they're like, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I can't believe that the Bible's true. And what I like to say to those people is, well, have you ever read it? And most of them would say, no, I've never read it. And my follow-up question is always, well, how do you know it's not true if you've never read it? That is quite a big statement to make, that something's not true if you're not going to take the time to read it. Don't you think you should maybe read it? And then if you still hold that position, that's cool, but man, maybe read it first. And people often say to me, well, why would I read something if I don't believe it's true? Again, the litmus test of what we read isn't whether something's true or not. Well, we read a lot of stuff that's not true or arguably true. We don't even know now when we're watching the news if what we're all reading the news, is it true or not? We see stuff on social media all the time. Is it all true? I don't know. Well, we read a lot of stuff that's not true. That's not the test. So I just say, hey, if you say the Bible's not true, then read it. But then on the second camp is you get a lot of people would say, no, the Bible's true. It's inerrant. It's infallible. It's the Word of God. And people hold that real firm. And I get that. But then I also because I like to stir, I say to them sometimes, well, have you read it? Have you read all of it? And oftentimes at that point, people start to squirm a little. And I say, well, have you read all of it? Because you're making a pretty bold statement that this entire thing is true. If you haven't read 20% of it, man, that's a lot of pages where there could be a lot of fiction. If you haven't read 10% of it, that's still a decent amount of material. Man, if you haven't read 3% of it, there could be a lot of stuff in there. I really recommend that you read it. And I just want to encourage you. No matter where you sit, are you at the Bible's not true? And I don't think you're there because you're here watching this. Or if you're right at the other end, I know that the Bible, it's the perfect, inerrant Word of God. I just encourage you, make sure you've read it and continue to read it, because I'll tell you what, this has the ability to shape us. It's often referred to as the living Word. And what I love about it is you can read the same passages over and over and over. And some of you have done this. You've read certain parts so many times that it can be easy to skim through it. But the incredible thing is when we read this, different things jump out all the time. And my experience has been that it really is something supernatural. There is something special about it because of the ability I have to read it and reread it and reread it and reread it, and the way that it continues to shape me and change the way that I see things and change the way that I see myself and the way that I see others and the way that I perceive and the way that I understand God. It really is remarkable. And so what I just want to do now is help your group have a good conversation around each other. And then the question I want you to ask is this: how were you first introduced to the Bible? How were you first introduced to this incredible collection of books? Well, why don't you talk about that? And we've got a few other questions to keep you going, but there's a great one to start with. How were you first introduced to the Bible? I'll see you next week.